Welcome back, my fellow peanuts, and welcome to anyone who's new to the podcast or to my channel. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. There may be graphic and violent content. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. Hi to everyone, and thank you so much for listening to Crimes from the Peanut Gallery. I hope you enjoyed the latest episode on the Boston Strangler. I would really love to hear what your favourite episodes are. Comment down below and tell me which one is yours. Would have to say mine's a toss-up between Ted Bundy and Danny Rolling. Ted, just because it's Ted Bundy, and there's just so much research, and I went down such a rabbit hole with that, and it was so amazing to do. Danny Rolling, because he inspired the Scream movies for me. Easily one of my favourite horror movie franchises. Speaking of horror movies, though, I'm going to have to go with my favourite of all time. Is an oldie but a goodie. It would be John Carpenter's Halloween 1 or 2. I can't listen to that song, Mr. Sandman, without getting goosebumps. It's just that whole scene with Jamie Lee Curtis walking down the street and Michael Myers being like in the distance and they're playing Mr. Sandman. It just gives me chills like every time I hear it. But I do digress a little bit on that, so I do apologise, guys. But you know that I love to go on a little bit of a tangent whenever I'm talking about anything on my podcast. Now, this week's state is going to be Wyoming. However, our serial killer has killed all across the USA. But I picked Wyoming as, for one, it's not a state we've done before, and two, it's kind of cool to be doing Wyoming. Our serial killer today, though, he predominantly killed in California, but he is known to have killed in Washington and New York. The police definitely suspect there's a lot more victims across the country, and they're really only just finding this out, and that's largely due to DNA. Though today Wyoming is our state, he did only receive one conviction in that particular state. However, he would eventually be convicted of 5 murders across multiple states. So he's truly a vile individual, guys. Our serial killer today is Rodney Alcala. He's sometimes referred to as the dating game killer. That's because he appeared as a contestant in 1978 on the show The Dating Game. What he really should have been called, in my personal opinion, is the vile and heinous acts of a disgusting human. But I'm really, again, guys, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So let's start like we always do at the beginning. Sorry, before I do begin this one, though, there are some really disturbing facts in regards to some of his murders. Some of the victims do involve children, so viewer discretion is advised. It's just some of the topics we're going to be talking about today, guys. They're not an easy listening. It's really just to make sure that you guys are aware. Okay, so Rodney James Alcala, he was born with the name Rodrigo Jacques Foucault. Now, he was born on August 23rd in 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. His parents were Raul Alcala Foucault and Maria Gutierrez. Now, he was their first boy, and I imagine he would have been quite the joy for both of his parents, being that he was the first boy. It has been reported that he's got 2 sisters, but there's not much more information available, and I don't even know if it's actually 2 sisters. This is definitely really unusual for our podcast, but I don't have any reports of any type of abuse or mistreatment in his childhood. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but there definitely are no records reflecting it. What I have been able to find, though, is that his family actually loved and supported him. This may be a case we're dealing with on this podcast where he was actually just born evil or bad. We are going to come back to that and sort of go along with that trail of thought in a little bit of time. Rodney would attend Mount Sacred Elementary School up until he was 8 years old, when the family would end up relocating to Mexico. They were hoping to get a bit better life in Mexico. Things would change about 3 years into that time. Their father, Raul, he'd end up abandoning them. His mum quickly made the decision to head back to the USA, but this time the family would actually settle in California. Now, he would attend multiple schools during his, I'm guessing like his childhood through to his high school. He had an IQ of 135. Now, this is a little bit above average intelligence, but I think that he definitely used this intelligence for fairly nefarious reasons going on. But when he attended Montebello High School, he was really quite popular. He'd be part of the yearbook committee. He was a part of the track team. He was just really well liked. And I suspect that it was during his time in the yearbook committee that he began to love of photography. After graduating, we're going to see someone again join the US Army. He wanted to become a paratrooper, but he would spend most of his time while in the Army as a clerk. He'd be stationed in North Carolina at Fort Liberty. Now, that was actually formerly called Fort Bragg. This name was changed after the death of George Floyd. The reason for this was because the base was actually named after a Confederate leader. I'm not going to be engaging in a debate about this, guys. If you know me, you already know my stance on civil rights. That's all I'm going to say, really on that matter. So please, I don't want to debate over this kind of stuff. So Rodney would end up only serving for 4 years, but he did best of reputations while he was actually in the Army. So during his time at the Army specifically, his commanding officer would make notes that he was fairly manipulative and very vindictive. He'd resist authority. He would constantly disobey orders. He was disciplined on more than one occasion for assaulting women as well. When he's just 19, his father would pass away. And even though he'd abandoned his family, he would actually attend with his whole entire family the funeral. Now, in June 1963, he'd actually ended up showing up at his mum's house in California, and he'd hitchhiked a ride 3,000 miles from North Carolina, and he'd gone AWOL. Now, shortly after this, he's been officially diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Now, this is often referred to as sociopathy, and he would be discharged from the Army on those medical grounds. It's a mental disorder where a person consistently shows no regard for right and wrong, ignores rights and feelings of other people, definitely lacks an empathetic side as well. And this is why I said at the start that maybe he was actually born bad as such. There's no indications that I've read or seen that he actually had any trauma from his childhood. I don't know this, so I'm not going to... This is, again, a lot of speculation from my end. After his discharge from the Army, he would attend the California State University. He would end up transferring to UCLA, and in 1968, he graduated with a fine arts degree. While at school, he really left quite the impression on his teachers and his classmates. He was described as highly intelligent. He was really charismatic, very handsome and charming. Now, before I do continue the next part of our podcast, I want to reiterate that some of the victims today are children, and this is going to disturb some of my viewers or my listeners. So I'm warning you guys, this gets quite heavy. It's always been assumed up until 2021 that Rodney's first victim was an 8-year-old girl by the name of Tali Shapira. In fact, another victim would come forward by the name of Morgan Rowan. She would end up contacting a retired detective via a blog, and she would actually tell her story of the encounter that she'd had with Rodney. And I'm telling you guys, it's actually really horrendous and really horrible. Now, she would tell in 1968, she met Rodney on the Sunset Strip with some of her friends in California. She mentioned that they danced, they laughed, and they'd hung out for hours. And they would end up getting into a car with him and hanging out for a little while and stopping in at IHOP just for some food. Now, after they'd attended this, she was already sort of getting a little bit of a gut feel that Rodney wasn't a great guy, but she was still with her friends. So when they were driving back to, where they were meant to drop her off, he would actually make a detour and go to a party at his place in his apartment. Other people were there. Morgan would end up getting separated from her friends, and Rodney would drag her into his room and put a bar over the door. He would tie her up, and he put a belt in her mouth, and he punched her in the stomach until she vomited blood. He would then proceed to rape and strangle her. Thankfully for Morgan, her friends actually became a little bit worried, and they came looking for her before discovering that there was a door that was barred. And they were so worried that one of her friends, in particular Mike, would break in through a window where they would find both Rodney and Morgan. He was naked from the waist down, and all they could see was that Morgan was covered in blood. The only words that Rodney said to her friends were, "Take her." And her friends were able to drag her away and, take her to an apartment and basically allow her to recover. Morgan would recover at her friend Mike's apartment. She'd end up calling her parents and saying that she was staying with a friend, so they had no idea what had actually gone on. Her friend Michael, who she was staying with, actually had a neighbour who happened to be a nurse. So he would actually help her through the injuries that she had received from Rodney. The next part, guys, of my podcast is really gruesome. It involves some really shocking things that happened to a little 8-year-old girl. And I do want to let you know, it's really quite graphic at times, guys. It's really, really quite graphic. So early on the morning of September 25th, 1968, about 2 weeks after Morgan's encounter, an 8-year-old little girl by the name of Tali was walking to school alone. She'd done it countless times, as you can imagine, and unfortunately this time she would encounter a monster. Now, at some point, a man would pull up beside her and ask her if she needed a ride. Now, after letting him know that she's not allowed to talk to strangers, she's just going to continue on her way. But that man was on a real mission. He would tell her that he'd actually been a friend of her parents and that they asked him to give her a lift. Once she heard this, she jumped straight in the car. She let her guard down. Now, thankfully, a motorist who actually witnessed this little interaction had a really strong feeling that something was just off. This man, in my opinion, was Tali's angel, and his name is Donald Haynes. When the vehicle that he was following pulled up in front of an apartment building, he would fear for that little girl so much so that he called the police and told them to get to that address as quickly as possible. Now, another angel of Tali's was a young police officer by the name of Chris Camacho. I think that's how you say it. He would knock on the apartment door, and he knocked and he said he could hear someone rummaging around inside that apartment, and he shouted to whoever was in the apartment that he needed to speak with him straight away. Now, Rodney would peer through the curtains and he told the officer that he couldn't open up the door because he had just jumped out of the shower. Now, the policeman noticed at the time that he's not wearing a towel, he's naked, he's not wet, he's got no clothes. It raised a lot of red flags, he said. It just immediately raised red flags for him. And he told Rodney straight away that he needed to open up that door or he would come in immediately. Rodney quickly replied and said, "Hey, let me just put some pants on." The officer would end up telling him he had 3 seconds. He ended up counting in his head to 5. He kicked the door open and he's immediately horrified by what he's about to encounter. He remembered seeing a dining room to the right, a living room to the left, and straight ahead was the kitchen. And on the kitchen floor was this little girl, this little tiny body lying on a floor, and she's just in a pool of her own blood. And the way he said it was, there was just blood everywhere. She had her clothes and her shoes and a dress thrown to the side. There were coins on the floor, and there's a steel bar across her neck, which probably weighed about 2 pounds. But, I mean, obviously she's not weighing any more than, I'm going to go with like 30 to 40 pounds. That's a lot. So officers that happened to appear on site really quickly said it was a scene they never, ever forgot, and they could never forget it in their whole entire lifetimes. They would say that there was way too much blood than they ever thought that could come out of a little girl. And next to this poor little girl is this white little pair of Mary Jane shoes. She had been beaten and raped within an inch of her life, and horribly and brutally. Now, the police officers immediately feared that she'd actually been dead, so that they began scouring, looking for Rodney. Now, the officer that originally, Chris Camachero, he said he went back and checked on Tali, and he just couldn't leave her alone. He just did not want her to die alone. And he said he grabbed the nearest towel that he could find, and he grabbed the pipe off her neck and tossed it to the side before witnessing a miracle. Little Tali was gagging for air, so she was trying. She was alive, and she was rushed straight to the hospital and treated for her injuries. She would spend 32 days in a coma and several months recovering from this. Now, when she's released, her family would end up relocating to Mexico. Rodney managed to escape whilst the police were trying to save Tali's life. He'd slipped out the back door and fled. Now, they would find a wallet in the apartment, and it would be for Rodney Alcala. The LAPD would end up turning to the FBI for help and had him listed on the most wanted list in 1969. Now, I've got to say, guys, this man is just vile, in my opinion. Absolutely vile. He has not only violated Morgan, who I believe at the time was either 14 or 15. She was really young herself. But then you've gone and done this to an 8-year-old girl. You have to be an absolute vile human being to even think about doing this type of things to children. But yeah, it was just a really, really hard thing to watch. I watched a lot of documentaries on this. And she was just an incredibly brave girl. I've got pictures up in the background of obviously Morgan and Tali now, and those two women, so incredibly brave to have survived that. So I just want to call out that so incredibly brave. I am going to just take a sip of my drink. I'm really sorry. Just a bit dry. He is definitely one of the most vile serial killers we've talked about on my podcast so far. Now, to avoid the arrest warrant from Tali's assault, Rodney would leave California and he'd enroll at NYU. He actually ended up using the alias John Berger. In 1971, he'd obtained a counselling job at an arts camp, and he was using a slightly different alias. He was using U instead of E in the Berger, and that's Berger or Beaugerger. Now, he began working also at the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, where he worked in the office with another serial killer, Richard Cottingham. He's another serial killer who murdered at least 18 women in New York and New Jersey. He's otherwise known as Times Square Killer or the Torso Killer. That is my next podcast, by the way, guys. So that's going to be awesome. Neither man has claimed to have been aware of the other, nor is there any evidence that they killed at the same time and that they had ever encountered each other other than that. So our next victim, it would take a bit more time to be solved. In 1971, Cornelia Crilley's body would be found raped and murdered in her apartment. Now, she'd been strangled with her own pantyhose, but her murder would remain unsolved until 2011. So in August 1971, two teenage girls from that summer camp, Rodney, or John Berger, as he was now calling himself, were actually just going off to the post office. And while they're there, they noticed this wanted poster with the John Berger's face on it. Now, at first, they're definitely like, no, that's just not right. But after a while, it just seemed a little bit odd. And they were like, well, also, this man's from California. They're in New Hampshire. They decided to take the poster just back to the head of camp, and he noticed the same resemblance really quickly himself. Now, he immediately identified the photo that John Berger was definitely Rodney Alcala. He's immediately calling the police. The police had told him that they would be out very shortly, and in the meantime, he and everyone are to act as normal as they possibly can and not give him any reason to be suspicious at all. The next day, they show up and they actually arrest John Berger, otherwise known as Rodney. Now, they compared his fingerprints to Rodney Alcala's and they confirmed a match. They contacted California and they were told to extradite him as quickly as possible. He was sat down and he was asked all about the incident with Tali Shapira. In response, he would say, oh, I forgot all about that. I don't want to talk about the things that Rod did. Now, in his mind, he's no longer Rodney Alcala. He's actually John Berger. And John Berger had not committed those crimes. Now, unfortunately, the police would reach out to Tali's family and it would just be with no luck. They refused to let Tali testify, and I can imagine that. They didn't want her to be subjected to recounting this most horrific incident that you shouldn't have to put a child through that. And I can understand that and I can respect that. So without her and her story, the police couldn't actually hold Rodney, and he had to they would actually have to plead him to a lesser charge of child molestation, and he would only serve 34 months in prison. But he did have to register as a sex offender. Now, even after being in prison, he really hadn't learnt his lesson, because in 1974, 13-year-old girl, only known as Julie, she made an emergency call claiming that a man had kidnapped her in Huntington Beach. She'd been waiting for the bus, and Rodney Alcala had offered her a ride to school. He then refused to let her out of his car, and he dragged Julie to the cliffs, and he forced her to smoke marijuana, and he kissed her. He was only convicted at the time of violating his parole and furnishing a minor with drugs, marijuana, and he would spend another 2 years in prison. But after his release, and even though he was a registered sex offender, he would land himself a job at the LA Times as a typesetter. And this was during the midst of the Hillside Stranglers. So his sexual assault charges previously would prompt the police to really quickly interview him as a potential suspect in those crimes. During this time, though, Rodney was able to convince dozens of women in parallel to this that he's a professional fashion photographer. He photographed them, many of them, for his portfolio. To this day, most of the women in those photos remain unidentified and are believed to be some more possible victims. I'm actually at the end of this podcast going to run through a video of some of that, so that if anyone does know them, reach out, do what you need to do, contact the police if you can, and in the US, obviously not in Australia. Now, I have no idea what was going through his parole officer's head at this time, but he would allow Rodney to travel to New York. Apparently, he was going to visit relatives. I have no doubt in my mind that that story is an absolute lie. Now, NYPD investigators believe that Rodney would murder a young Manhattan socialite by the name of Ellen Hoover. She's 23 and she's the daughter of Herman Hoover. He's the owner of Ciro's, a legendary Hollywood nightclub. Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin were actually her godfathers. So she's last seen in her apartment on 3rd Avenue at 44th Street in July 1977. Her date book would end up showing that she had an appointment on that very day to meet up with a gentleman by the name of John Berger. Her stepfather would hire a private investigator, and the family took out an ad in the New York Times soliciting information and asking for information on this John Berger. No one came forward with any information on John Berger until later that year, and it was a tip to the FBI that pointed out a New Hampshire drama counselor named John Berger had been taken away by the police a few years before. Now, the FBI finally connected the dots and questioned him while he was still living in Los Angeles. He admitted to knowing Ellen, but investigators hadn't yet found her body, so they let him go and then eventually filed the case away as a missing person. She was eventually found on the Rockefeller estate in North Tarrington in New York. Now, that's just miles away from the family summer house and mere yards from where she was an aspiring model, would later report that he'd taken photos of her. But Rodney Alcala, he's gone back to California. There's no charges against him. He's continued photographing women, and there were some young boys in those. So from November 1977 to December 1977, he would violently rape and murder 18-year-old Jill Barcombe and 27-year-old Georgia Wixst. Initially, the police would actually believe that the Hillside Strangler was responsible for Jill's murder just because the serial killer was working in the same area at the time. Now, at some stage, you are going to see a podcast on the Hillside Stranglers because they definitely intrigue me. Sorry, got sidetracked. Jill Barcombe, she's a runaway originally from Brooklyn. She's one of 11 kids. She volunteered as a candy striper and she played the trumpet in high school. She's barely 5 feet tall and she weighed less than 100 pounds when her abductor picked her up on Sunset Boulevard. Her body was found on a service road just off Mulholland Drive, and it was right near Marlon Brando's home. And that would be in November 1977. She's nude and she's kneeling as if she's been deliberately posed. Her skull had been crushed, probably with a rock of some sort, and that had been found nearby. They'd found a bloodied rock nearby. She'd been raped and she'd been strangled 3 times with a belt, her own pantyhose, and with one of her pants. The investigators now say that the DNA evidence at the scene would match Rodney Alcala. So, in December 1977, Georgia Wixst, a 27-year-old nurse, was discovered in her Malibu apartment. This is just a month after Jill Barcombe's murder, and a few days later, that was when the FBI would actually question him about Ellen's death in New York earlier that year. Georgia, who happened to be 27, was last seen when she drove another nurse by the name of Barbara Gale. She'd been driven home from a bar, and when she didn't show up for work the next day, Barbara and their co-workers would report her missing pretty quickly. Police would arrive at her apartment to find signs that there'd been forced entry. She was posed naked on the bedroom floor. She'd also been strangled with her own pantyhose. She had been raped as well. Her skull had been bashed in, and that was possibly with a hammer. And she'd been mutilated in her genitals area. The prosecutors now say that DNA evidence and a handprint found at the scene would be Rodney Alcala's. And now we get to why he was called the dating game killer. In September 1978, a woman by the name of Cheryl Bradshaw appeared on an episode of The Dating Game. The show at the time, it didn't run background checks on any of the contestants. Why would you? You wouldn't think that someone with a criminal record would go on a show like that, would you? And certainly no one knew of Rodney's background. He was introduced as a successful photographer who got his start when his father found him in a dark room at the age of 13, fully developed. Cheryl would ask him to describe what kind of meal he would be, and Rodney responded with, "I'm called the banana and I look really good. Peel me." It's just gross. Ultimately, though, Cheryl would choose him as the winner just due to his charm and his charisma. She really did think that he was quite charming. However, when she met him face to face, she claimed that he was acting really creepy and she just got a really weird vibe off him. And she ended up not actually going on that date. Thank God for her. That's all I'm going to say. But yeah, that's why he's called the dating game killer. Between June 1978 and June 1979, the bodies of a 31-year-old by the name of Charlotte Lamb, 21-year-old Jill Horento, and a 12-year-old by the name of Robin Samsoe were found. All bodies would show signs of violent sexual assault, severe beating, strangling, and stab wounds. So in June 1978, Charlotte Lamb, she's a 32-year-old legal secretary from Santa Monica. She is found under similar circumstances to Georgia Wixst. She was found in the laundry room of the apartment complex where she was living. She'd been sexually assaulted, she'd been beaten, strangled with a shoelace, and she was posed with her hands behind her back. DNA, once again at the scene, turned out to be Rodney Alcala, and DNA on a pair of earrings that's found in a storage locker after Robin's murder would eventually prove to match Charlotte's DNA. There would be a victim in between the murders. She would survive. Her name is Monique. In February 1979, Rodney would admit that he picked up a 15-year-old hitchhiker in Riverside County. He would drive her to his apartment. They engaged in intercourse, according to him, supposedly consensual. In the morning, when they drove to the mountains, he'd take nude photos of her as well as several of the two of them simulating sex acts. But he really scared her. She screamed and actually tried to get away. He would then tie her up and he would beat her and rape her. In his confession, though, he would claim that it hadn't been planned and things had just gone awry. He'd lost control of the situation. He ended up driving her back to Riverside, and from a motel, she would actually call the police and report the rape and the kidnapping. His mother would end up posting his bail, but before he would be convicted of anything, he was actually set to murder his next victim. So in June 1979, Jill, 21-year-old computer key punch operator, she left work early to attend a baseball game. When she didn't make it to work the next day, the police would go to her apartment just to investigate because people had said she's missing. That's where they would find her dead. Jill was naked. She was on the bathroom floor. She was posed with pillows underneath her shoulders. She had also been raped. She'd been beaten and she'd also been strangled. However, her killer had actually cut himself while crawling through a window, and blood evidence would prove that within 3% of the population did not rule out or confirm that Rodney Alcala was the perpetrator. So there's a 3% chance that he wasn't. Jill's friend, however, Catherine Bryant, she would testify that she and Jill had met Rodney at a club several times. So it appears as though that he may have possibly stalked her. That same month that Jill was raped and murdered, this is where he kills Robin Samsoe. Before I continue, it just a little bit of a change of MO there with him, because obviously he stalked his victim with this one. So it makes me believe that maybe he was stalking some of his victims previously, and there's a possibility that this is not the first time he's done something like this. Now, unfortunately, it would take the death of a 12-year-old girl to catch him. On June 20th, 1979, Robin Samsoe, she's a 12-year-old girl from Huntington Beach. Beautiful area, by the way. She was on her way to a ballet class. She was late, so she ended up borrowing her best friend's Schwinn bicycle. She and the bicycle would disappear on the same day. 12 days after Robin was last seen, there would be people from a maintenance crew would stumble upon some human bones some 40 miles away from Huntington Beach. The remains would be identified as those of her, of that missing girl. Her left foot and portions of her hands were missing, and her skull had been separated from her neck. A kitchen knife and one of her shoes was nearby, and unfortunately she was so decomposed they couldn't determine whether she had been sexually assaulted. After her body was found, though, Robin's friends came forward and told the police that that day they'd been approached at the beach by a man who wanted to take pictures of Robin, and that was the last time they actually saw her at that time. But obviously she'd gone back to her best friend's house because she's both her best friends. But this would end up, so detectives ended up creating a sketch of that photographer, and Rodney's parole officer would almost immediately recognise him. So this prompted the police to search his mother's home where he'd been staying. Now, while inside, they would find a rental receipt for a storage locker in Seattle. They obtained a warrant pretty quickly for that storage locker as well. While they're searching through there, they noticed that what turned out was hundreds of photos were found. It would be mostly of young girls. In many of these photos, the subjects, they were either nude or they were in their swimsuits, just in very provocative positions. Rodney was even in some of them, and the locker ended up containing a pair of earrings which belonged to Robin, and another pair that was found to actually match the DNA of Charlotte Lamb. With this evidence, really quickly, the police were able to finally charge him for Robin's murder. Now, he would plead innocent. He had pled innocent to the charges of kidnapping, lewd, and lascivious acts upon a child under 14, murder and robbery that were filed against him. Now, the trial was a shit show, guys. His public defender was forced to step down due to a conflict of interest, and a new one had to be appointed during that time. The preliminary hearings began. Rodney was also supposed to stand trial not only for Robin's murder, but another victim who had survived. So that was that Monique. However, this victim was determined too unfit to testify and was ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment. The judge ordered that all of Rodney's previous offences related to abductions and sexual misconduct were allowed to be used in evidence. But on March 6, 1980, opening statements would begin. The fact that he allowed previous charges to come in, that's going to come back and bite him in the bum. A key witness testified that she'd seen Rodney forcing a young blonde girl into the woods in June of 1979. She claimed that she'd returned to the site a few days later and saw a body. Inmates that knew Rodney in prison, they were made to testify against him, but their testimony was discredited really quickly because they were learning and they realised that the informers were getting something out of it. The defence asked for a dismissal of the kidnapping charges. We claimed there's no physical proof that a kidnapping had ever occurred. Many other people were called to testify on his behalf as alibi witnesses. Among them were his sisters, an ex-girlfriend who swore he couldn't have been involved with Robin's murder. All of them were really, really biased witnesses, though, guys. Like, you can imagine that, of course, they're going to say no, that that's not who he is. Final arguments would begin. The jury took 2 days to deliberate and ultimately would find him guilty on the charge of first-degree murder with the use of a deadly weapon and forced kidnapping. He has been sentenced. As a result, he's sentenced to death. But this sentence would be overturned twice. First in 1984 because the jury was told about those previous convictions before the trial, and then in 1986 on the grounds that a witness had actually been hypnotised by the police or by someone. This is just insane to me. It took them years to actually get him finally locked down. In 2003, when a third trial of Rodney was being planned, his DNA, which had been taken during his time in prison, it would connect him to 2 other victims. In 2010, he was tried for a total of 5 murders. Roman Samsoe, Jill Barcombe, Georgia Wixst, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parenteau. He was found guilty on all counts, and in 2011, he was indicted for the New York murders of Cornelia Crilley and Helen Hoover, and in December of 2012, he pled guilty to both of those murders. On January 7th the following year, so 2013, he was given another life sentence. He's also believed to be responsible for the murder of a 19-year-old by the name of Pamela Jean in San Francisco, but isn't charged with it since there are no fingerprints and there's no DNA that can implicate him further. The reason I picked Wyoming is due to this victim. In September 2016, he was charged with the murder of 28-year-old Christine Ruth Thornton. Now, she and her boyfriend moved away from her family in San Antonio in Texas, and in June 1977, after she'd broken up with her boyfriend, she was last seen hitchhiking and was never seen or heard from again. In 2013, an image was made public by Huntington Beach PD and NYPD of a dark-haired woman riding a motorcycle while wearing a yellow shirt. This person was recognized by her sister. By the way, that picture on in the background now. Her body was found in Sweetwater County in Wyoming along Interstate 80 in 1982, but was not identified until 2015 when DNA supplied by Christine's relatives matched the sample from her remains. Now, Rodney admitted to taking the photo, but not to killing the woman, who was approximately 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. She is the first alleged murder victim linked to his photos that were released in 2010. The 73-year-old Rodney was reportedly too ill to make the journey from California to Wyoming to stand trial and to face those new charges. He was found guilty. Now, on July 24th, 2021, he died of natural causes at the age of 77. At the time of his death, he was still on death row and awaiting execution for the murders that he was convicted of in California. Once again, we see a killer die of natural causes. And where is the justice for the people? I'm hoping I will make sure that for at least the next 30 seconds, you're just going to see a bunch of photos. Hopefully someone will recognize those people and hopefully there'll be some justice for these victims. But thank you so much for listening to episode 24, guys. If you like this podcast, please hit that subscribe button. Go back and listen to the other episodes. Make sure that you listen to the Halloween episode that I did last year. That one's on Martha Moxley. I hope you all have a fabulous weekend, my fellow peanuts, and thank you so much. See ya.